The morning her driver disappeared, Audra Langley hired a stranger to replace him. She had 4 hours until the most important signing of her career. She did not have time to ask questions. The man showed up on time, held the door without being told, and said almost nothing. His name was Callum Reese, single father, no remarkable history. Exactly the kind of person no one looks at twice. He changed their route without permission, 20 minutes into the drive. Audra demanded an explanation. He gave her none. Then the road he had refused to take became a staged accident, one that would have stopped her car exactly where someone wanted it stopped. That was only the beginning. By midday, Audra was locked inside a private conference room, a gun at her back, a camera pointed at her face. The man holding it had spent months planning exactly this moment. Callum came through the door alone. No backup, no announcement. Within minutes, every armed man in that room was on the floor. A retired naval officer stared at him from the hallway, unable to speak. "Chief Reese, if you're new here, welcome. We tell stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next." The call came at 7:41 in the morning, 2 minutes before Audra was supposed to walk out the door. Sloan Merritt, her assistant, delivered the news the way she delivered every piece of bad information. Quickly, cleanly, with the expression of someone who had already braced for the response. Jonas Pell had not shown up. His phone was off. His car was still in the garage on level B2, parked exactly where he had left it the night before. And no one had seen him since. Audra stood in the lobby of Harbor Light Medical's Baltimore headquarters and said nothing for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Get me another driver." "I already did," Sloan said. "He's pulling up now." Callum Reese had been awake since 5. Not because of anxiety or habit, but because Marin had a science fair project due at the end of the week, and she had decided that 6:30 in the morning was the correct time to ask whether vinegar and baking soda counted as a chemical reaction or a physical one. He had answered her, made her breakfast, dropped her at school, and was halfway through his second cup of coffee when the dispatch notification came through. Corporate client, downtown pickup, full day, possibly longer. He accepted without reading further. The rate was good, and he needed the hours. He was not the kind of man who needed to know more than that. Audra assessed him in the time it took to walk from the lobby doors to the car. Tall, calm, the kind of stillness that either meant someone had nothing going on inside or had learned to keep all of it very far below the surface. He held the rear door open, waited until she was seated, and closed it without a word. No introduction, no small talk, no attempt to fill the silence. She appreciated that, at least. "Harbor Light has a signing today," she said, pulling up her documents on her tablet. "Coastal retreat 40 minutes north. I need to be there by 11. "Understood," Callum said. That was all. Audra went back to her screen. The Care Bridge contract was 312 pages long, and she had read every word of it twice. But she read the critical sections a third time now, because that was the kind of CEO she was. Care Bridge was not a product line or a quarterly target. It was a network of mobile clinics and low-cost diagnostic equipment designed to reach communities that had been written off by every major healthcare system in the country. Rural towns without hospitals, urban neighborhoods without access to elderly residents who could not travel. It was, in the simplest terms, the reason she had started the company. Her mother had died in a small town in western Maryland on a Tuesday afternoon, waiting for an ambulance that took 53 minutes to arrive. Audra had been 22. She had sat beside her mother in a gas station parking lot, on the phone with a dispatcher who kept telling her help was on the way, and she had made herself a promise she had spent the last 8 years trying to keep. Carebridge was that promise. Today was the day it was supposed to become real, which meant she could not afford to think about Jonas. She thought about Jonas anyway. 20 minutes into the drive, when the silence had settled into something almost comfortable, she found herself staring at the back of Callum's head and thinking about the coffee. Still hot. That was the part she could not set aside. Jonas had been in that garage recently enough that his coffee was still steaming, and then he was simply gone. No note. No message. 11 minutes of security footage replaced by static. Sloan said he might have quit. Audra said, not entirely sure why she was saying it out loud. Callum glanced at the rearview mirror. His car is still in the garage. I know. People who quit don't leave their cars behind. Audra looked up from her tablet. You noticed that? I noticed the coffee too, he said. And the camera on level B had a signal gap from 6:47 to 6:58. 11 minutes is long enough to move someone without being seen. The tablet felt heavier in her hands. You think something happened to him? I think it's worth considering. She studied the back of his head for a moment longer. You're a driver. Today, Callum said. She didn't know what to do with that answer, so she let it go. He changed the route 9 minutes later. Audra felt the car shift direction and looked up immediately. The coastal highway, the route she had taken to this venue twice before, was no longer in front of them. Callum had turned inland toward the longer road that added at least 15 minutes to their drive. What are you doing? She asked. Taking a different route? I need to be there by 11. We don't have 15 extra minutes. We have 12, he said. It's enough. I didn't ask for your judgment on the schedule. I asked you to drive. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved between the road ahead and the mirrors, right, left, center, right again, with a steadiness that had nothing to do with normal traffic awareness. She had ridden with enough drivers to know the difference between someone checking their mirrors and someone watching. Callum was watching. There's been a black SUV behind us since we left the building, he said. It held the same distance through 3 light changes and didn't pull off when we turned. I don't want to take you onto an isolated stretch of highway with a tail I can't identify. Audra turned to look through the rear window. Don't, he said. If they don't know you've noticed, we have more options. She faced forward. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a name for. Yet, not quite fear, not quite adrenaline, something in between. You could be wrong, she said. I could be, Callum agreed. But I'd rather be wrong on the safe road than right on the wrong one. She wanted to argue. She had a contract to sign and a partner who was already looking for reasons to question her competence. And the last thing she needed was a detour based on a feeling from a man she had hired 40 minutes ago. But something in the quality of his attention, the way he held the wheel, the way his eyes never stopped moving, made her think that arguing would be the wrong call. She said nothing. They were 4 miles down the inland route when her phone buzzed with an alert from a local traffic application. Accident on the coastal highway. Multi-vehicle. Southbound lanes blocked. The location was a narrow stretch of road flanked by guardrails on one side and a drop on the other. Exactly the kind of place where a car could be stopped and there would be nowhere to go. Audra stared at the notification for a long moment. Callum. I saw it. That's where we would have been. Yes, she set her phone down carefully, the way she set things down when she needed her hands to have something to do. Outside, the Maryland landscape moved past the windows, familiar, unchanged, completely ordinary. Inside the car, something had shifted, in a way she couldn't quite name. Who are you? She asked. He looked at her in the rearview mirror, Not evasively, just steadily. The way a person looks when they've decided how much of a true thing to say. "A driver," he said. "For today." Audra held his gaze in the mirror for a moment, then looked away. She pulled up the Carebridge contract on her tablet and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. Brennan Locke was waiting for them at the entrance of the coastal retreat when they arrived at 10:58. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and built like a man who had spent decades in rooms where he was always the most important person present. He was the chairman of Locke Meridian, one of Harbor Light's largest investors, and he had been making it quietly clear for the past 6 months that he believed Carebridge was a mistake, not because he thought it wouldn't work, because he thought it wouldn't pay. "Audra," he said, with the kind of warmth that had no warmth in it. "I was beginning to wonder." "You don't need to wonder," she said. "I'm here." He glanced past her at Callum, who had stepped out of the car and was standing near the hood, not looking at them, but not looking either. "New driver?" "For today," Audra said. Brennan smiled. Of course. He held the door open for her, and she walked inside, and she did not look back at Callum. But she was aware, in the specific way you become aware of things that matter before you understand why they matter, that he was still watching the parking area with the same careful, quiet attention he had given everything else since the moment she had gotten into his car. She thought about the coffee again. Hot. Still hot. She thought about 11 minutes of missing footage. She thought about a road that had become an accident scene at exactly the moment she would have been on it. By the time she reached the conference room and shook the hands that needed to be shaken and smiled at the people who needed to be smiled at, she had made a decision. She did not know who Callum Reese was. She did not know what he had done before today or what had made him the kind of man who watched exits and counted seconds and changed routes without being asked. But she was going to find out. She just didn't know yet that by the time she did, she would be locked in a room she couldn't leave, and he would be the only person coming to open it. The signing was scheduled for noon. By 11:30, Audra already knew something was wrong. It wasn't Brennan. Or rather, it wasn't only Brennan. It was the room itself. The way the retreat staff had rearranged the seating so that Audra's chair faced away from the door. The way 2 of the board members she had spoken with that morning were now avoiding her eyes. The way Brennan moved through the space like a man who had already decided how the afternoon would end and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She kept her face neutral and her posture straight, and she went through the motions of preparation, organizing her folders, reviewing the final signature pages, exchanging pleasantries with the legal team, while a quiet alarm worked its way up from somewhere below her sternum. Outside in the parking area, Callum sat in the car and did not go anywhere. He had told himself he would wait. That was the job drive, wait, drive back. He had done it 100 times. Whatever happened inside the building was not his business, and getting involved in things that were not his business was something he had worked very deliberately to stop doing. But the black SUV was in the parking lot, different plates than the one that had followed them from Baltimore. Same model, same tinted windows, same positioning angled slightly toward the exit. Engine cold. No visible occupant. Either it was a coincidence or someone had driven ahead to be here before them. Callum got out of the car. He didn't go inside. He walked the perimeter of the parking area, slowly, the way someone might walk to stretch their legs after a long drive. And he looked at things the way he had been trained to look at them, not at the obvious, but at what was adjacent to the obvious. The staff entrance on the east side of the building, propped open with a rubber wedge. The camera above the main entrance angled 2 degrees too far left to capture the side door. The retreat employee in a gray uniform who had been standing near the service corridor for 11 minutes without doing anything that looked like work. He recognized the type. Private contractor, not venue staff. The posture gave it away. The specific placement of the hands, the way the eyes moved in patterns rather than naturally. Someone had positioned this man here, and the man was pretending not to be positioned. Callum noted the staff entrance. He noted the camera blind spot. He took out his phone and sent a single text to a number he hadn't used in 2 years. Then went back to the car and waited for a reply that came in 4 minutes. The reply confirmed what he already suspected. The black SUV's alternate plates were registered to a shell company connected to 3 other vehicles used in 2 prior corporate security incidents on the East Coast. This was not a coincidence. This was infrastructure. He went inside. He moved through the staff entrance and into the service corridor that ran along the east side of the building, parallel to the main conference rooms. The corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit, lined with supply carts and folded tablecloths and the general debris of a venue that handled large events. It smelled like industrial cleaning solution and reheated coffee. He was looking for Jonas, but he was also looking at everything else. Every door, every junction, every point where the corridor connected to the main building. He was building a map in his head, the way he had been trained to build maps. Not just of the physical space, but of the time it would take to move between any 2 points within it. He found Jonas at the far end of the corridor, behind a door secured with a bright steel padlock that was considerably newer than the door it was attached to. The padlock had been installed recently. The paint around the hasp was undisturbed, which meant it had gone on after the venue's last maintenance cycle, which the scuff marks on the floor suggested was several months ago. He didn't break it. The contractor in the gray uniform had a key ring on his belt. Callum had relieved him of it 2 minutes earlier, quietly, at a junction in the corridor where the camera coverage had a 4-second gap between sweep cycles. The man was sitting against the wall, now zip-tied with the restraints he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket, unhurt and considerably more cooperative than he had been before the conversation started. Jonas Pell was inside, zip-tied to a metal chair, with a strip of tape across his mouth and a bruise forming along his left cheekbone. He was conscious. When he saw Callum, his eyes went wide, not with relief, but with something more urgent than relief. Callum removed the tape carefully. Jonas spoke in a low, rapid voice. He had been approached 2 days ago, he said. A man he didn't recognize had told him to come to level B3 of the Harbor Light Garage at 6:45 in the morning. Someone wanted to talk about Carebridge. He had gone because he thought it might be a journalist or a concerned investor, the kind of anonymous contact that happens sometimes in this industry. Instead, 2 men had been waiting. They had taken his phone, zip-tied his hands, and put him in a car. They hadn't hurt him beyond the bruise which had happened when he tried to pull away, but they had been very clear he would stay out of sight until the signing was finished, and then they would decide what to do with him. The data, Jonas said. They took it from my laptop. The original Carebridge database, patient projections, deployment maps, community health records, all of it. Who sent them? Jonas looked at him. You work for Audra. You already know who. Callum said nothing. Brennan's been planning this for weeks, Jonas said. The accident on the highway that was meant to delay her or stop her entirely. When you took the other road, they had to move to the backup plan. What's the backup plan? Jonas's jaw tightened. She's already in it. Callum looked at his watch. He untied Jonas's hands and helped him to his feet. Can you walk? Yes. Then stay here. Don't go into the main corridor. I'm going to send someone to you in the next 10 minutes. He paused at the door. Is there anything else I need to know before I go in there? Jonas looked at him for a moment, at the steadiness of his hands, the economy of his movements, the complete absence of urgency in his voice despite everything that had just been said. "Who are you?" Jonas asked. "Someone who was in the parking lot," Callum said. He went back into the corridor. Inside the main conference room, Brennan made his first move at 11:45. He did it quietly, the way he did everything. A word here, a document slid across the table there. He had prepared a supplemental financial analysis of CareBridge, he said. Just something the board should consider before signing. He presented it with the casual authority of a man who considered objection a formality. The analysis was a demolition. It reframed every number in the CareBridge proposal projected operating costs. Inflated by 30%. Revenue timelines extended by 3 years. Risk assessments rewritten to emphasize liability rather than impact. In Brennan's version, CareBridge wasn't a healthcare initiative. It was an expensive experiment with a high probability of public failure. "The technology itself is sound," Brennan said in the tone of someone offering a compliment while taking everything away. "The problem is the market Audra has chosen to serve. Mobile clinics for low-income communities generate goodwill, not returns. If we redirect the platform toward premium outpatient services, we recover the development cost within 18 months. Audra set down her pen. "What you're describing," she said, "is a completely different company." "What I'm describing," Brennan said, "is a company that survives. CareBridge was built for people who don't have options. The moment you move it upmarket, the people it was designed to serve lose the only thing that was built specifically for them." Brennan smiled. It was the smile of a man who found sincerity professionally inconvenient. "That's a beautiful position, Audra. It will read very well in the press coverage of your tenure." The room went quiet. Several board members shifted in their seats. The legal team looked at the table. Audra looked at Brennan. "I'm not changing the mission," she said. "No," Brennan agreed pleasantly. "I don't suppose you are." He gathered his papers and sat back, and the meeting moved forward. And Audra understood, in the specific way you understand things you wish you didn't, that the supplemental analysis was not an argument. It was an opening act. Callum reached the main corridor at 12:05 and sent the text he had promised Jonas a contact number for Admiral Adrian Pike, who was somewhere in the building, and who owed Callum a debt that had been sitting uncollected for 4 years. The message was 4 words: East Corridor, medical needed, now. Then he moved toward the conference room. He was 10 feet from the door when Brennan's security team found him. There were 3 of them, private contractors, positioned at intervals along the corridor, in a pattern that was designed to look like standard event security, but was spaced for containment rather than access control. The one in front stepped into his path and said that the signing session was closed to non-attendees. Callum looked at him for a moment. "I need to speak with Audra Langley," he said. "Ms. Langley is in a private meeting." "I understand that. I need to speak with her." "That's not going to happen." The man's hand moved to Callum's arm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." Callum looked at the hand on his arm, then at the man's face, then at the 2 behind him. He ran a calculation that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with geometry. Distances, response times, the angle of the corridor, the location of the nearest door. "All right," he said. He stepped back. He let them escort him to the far end of the hallway and position themselves between him and the conference room door. He stood where they put him and looked cooperative and gave them no reason to watch him as carefully as they should have. He spent the next 4 minutes learning the room. The conference suite had a secondary audio system running ambient background sound, piped through ceiling speakers for the event currently playing at low volume, enough to account for sounds that might otherwise carry through the door. The corridor ceiling was standard acoustic tile, which dampened rather than reflected. The contractors were positioned with their backs to the emergency exit, which meant they were watching him and not the door behind them. He noted all of this. Then he waited. Inside the conference room, Brennan made his second move. He had waited until the legal team stepped out for a break and the board members were occupied with their phones. Then he stood, walked to the conference room door, and locked it. The sound of the bolt was not loud, but in a room that had gone suddenly quiet, it was loud enough. "What are you doing?" Audra asked. Brennan turned from the door. He was holding a phone not his own, she realized. Hers. He must have taken it from her bag during the meeting, in one of the moments she had been looking at something else. "Audra," he said, "I want you to understand that none of this needed to happen this way. I gave you 18 months to reconsider the direction of CareBridge. I had 3 separate conversations with you about market positioning. I made very clear what the alternative would look like." She stood. "Unlock the door." In a moment, he set her phone on the table and turned a small camera toward her, a compact device already running. "I need about 4 minutes of your time. A brief statement acknowledging the operational failures of the CareBridge program and your decision to step down from the CEO position, effective immediately. Very simple, very clean." Audra looked at the camera. She looked at Brennan. She looked at the locked door and thought about the board members on the other side of it, and the legal team in the hallway, and her phone sitting on the table 6 feet away. "You bribed someone to kidnap my driver?" she said. "I arranged for a temporary delay," Brennan said. "Jonas is fine. He'll be released this evening. This is business, Audra, not a crime novel." "You staged an accident on the coastal highway." "A traffic complication. No one was hurt." "You changed the data on the presentation screens." Brennan tilted his head. "The data I presented is accurate. The data you've been presenting to investors is optimistic to the point of negligence. I'm correcting a distortion, not creating one." "CareBridge works," she said. "The pilot programs have the outcomes to prove it." "CareBridge is a charity dressed up as a business, and the market doesn't reward charity." He picked up the remote and pointed it at the camera. 4 minutes, Audra. Then this is done, and we all move forward." She thought about her mother. She thought about a gas station parking lot in Western Maryland and a dispatcher's voice and the specific quality of a silence that means someone is running out of time. She thought about the communities on the CareBridge deployment map, the dots in rural counties and underserved neighborhoods that represented real addresses, real families, real people who had been waiting for a system that would finally see them. Then she reached into the breast pocket of her jacket and pressed record on the secondary device she kept there. A small digital recorder she carried to document meetings when something felt off. She had picked it up from her bag that morning out of habit, without thinking. Now she understood why. She looked at the camera. She sat down, not because she was going to say what Brennan wanted her to say, but because she needed him to believe she might just long enough. Callum moved on the 4th minute. The conference suite's ambient sound system was still running. He had identified the circuit box for the East Corridor's secondary speaker system on his perimeter walk. It was in the utility alcove 12 feet behind the 3 contractors, accessible from the emergency exit they had their backs to. He had propped that exit open with a folded piece of cardstock while they were watching him. He came back through it quietly. The first contractor went down without a sound. Controlled pressure at a precise point. The kind of technique that worked because it was fast, and because the person it happened to didn't understand what was happening until it was already over. The second turned, but turned toward where Callum had been, rather than where he was. The third was faster and more trained than the other two, and the exchange between them was brief and efficient, and left Callum with a cut along his left forearm from the edge of a belt buckle. He wrapped it with a strip torn from his undershirt while he walked to the conference room door. The lock was a standard lever handle with a push-button privacy bolt. He had it open in 4 seconds. He stepped inside. Brennan turned at the sound of the door, and his composure cracked, just for a moment. A single beat of genuine surprise before the control came back down over his face. He stepped back from the camera. His right hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," Callum said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been all day, quiet, without force, without performance. But something in the quality of it stopped Brennan's hand where it was. Audra was on her feet. Her eyes moved from Callum to Brennan to the door and back to Callum, running the same fast calculation he had run in the hallway. "Jonas is safe," Callum said to her. "East Service Corridor. Adrian Pike is with him." He looked at her steadily. "I need you to walk to this door." She walked. Brennan moved not toward Callum, but toward Audra, one hand reaching for her arm. Callum had placed himself between them before Brennan's hand traveled 8 inches, and Brennan found himself looking at a man who had not raised his voice, had not changed his expression, had not made a single unnecessary movement, and was nevertheless completely immovable. "This is over," Callum said. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look powerful men give when they are realizing for the first time that power is contextual. Then from the hallway a voice. "Chief Reese!" It was not a question, though it sounded like one. Admiral Adrian Pike was standing in the doorway, 60 years old, straight-backed, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades in uniform. He was here as a private investor, and he was staring at Callum with an expression that had nothing to do with the room they were standing in. Callum turned his head. "Admiral," he said. Adrian Pike looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Brennan. Then he looked at Audra, who was standing at Callum's side with her jacket pocket recorder still running. "I think," Admiral Pike said quietly, "that we should get some people in here." The next 17 minutes were the quietest crisis Audra had ever been inside. No shouting, no running, no moment where everything collapsed into chaos and someone had to pull the situation back from the edge. Callum moved through it the way he had moved through everything else that day, steadily, without announcement, doing exactly what needed to be done and nothing more. Admiral Pike made 3 calls from the hallway. 2 were to people Audra didn't know. 1 was to the local FBI field office, and he made it in a tone that suggested the person on the other end would not be putting him on hold. When he finished, he walked back to the doorway of the conference room and looked at Callum with the expression of a man sorting through a great many things he wanted to say and setting most of them aside for later. "You should have called me," the Admiral said. "I handled it," Callum said. "I noticed." Pike looked at the cut on Callum's forearm, wrapped in a strip of gray fabric already drying. "Get that looked at. After." Pike shook his head once, the way someone shakes their head when they know arguing is pointless, and went back to his phone. Callum crossed to where Audra was standing near the window and handed her a bottle of water that had been sitting untouched on the conference table. She took it without speaking. Her hands were steady, which he noted, because it told him something about her. "The paramedics are with Jonas," he said. "Admiral Pike sent someone to the East Corridor the moment I texted him. Jonas is shaken, but he'll be all right. His wife has been called." Audra nodded. She was looking out the window at the parking lot below, at the black SUV that was still angled toward the exit. Engine cold, going nowhere now. "The recorder," she said. "In my pocket. I started it before you came in. I know. I saw you reach for your jacket. She turned to look at him. How long did you know what Brennan was planning? I knew something was wrong when I saw the second SUV in the parking lot. I knew what it was when Jonas told me. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't get to you sooner. You got to me, she said. That's what matters. She meant it as a simple statement of fact, and he received it that way, and neither of them said anything further about it. The recording was 41 minutes long. She had not realized how much of Brennan's plan he had narrated aloud until she played it back for the FBI agents who arrived at 1 o'clock. Brennan's voice on the recording was clear and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been certain he was in a sealed room. He described the arrangement with Jonas as a temporary delay. He described the data manipulation as a correction. He described the staged accident on the coastal highway with the specific detachment of someone who had considered the risk and decided it was acceptable. He used the word acceptable twice. When the board members heard the recording, 2 of them left the room without speaking. When the legal team heard it, they stopped working for Loch Meridian and started working for themselves. When Admiral Pike heard the full version, he listened without expression, then handed Audra's recorder back to her and said, Keep that somewhere safe. Brennan was escorted from the building at 1:15 by 2 agents who had arrived in an unmarked car. He walked out without speaking. At the door, he turned once and looked back at Audra. Not with anger, not with the cold pleasantness he had worn all morning, but with something that might have been, in a different man, the beginning of understanding. She didn't look away until the door closed behind him. The signing happened at 3 o'clock. It was not the signing Audra had planned. The venue was wrong. They ended up in a smaller room on the north side of the building, with folding chairs and a table that was slightly too short, and 2 board members were absent, and the catering had been forgotten entirely. One of the remaining investors had brought a thermos of coffee that he passed around without ceremony, and someone found a box of individually wrapped crackers in a cabinet. And the legal team produced clean copies of the Cambridge contract from a laptop bag that had somehow survived the afternoon intact. Audra signed her name on the final page at 3:14 and set down the pen and looked at the room around her, at the investors who had stayed, at the board members who had not left, at the legal team members who were already making calls to restructure Loch Meridian's stake in the company. And she understood something she had known intellectually for years, but had never felt in her body until this moment. Cambridge was real. It was going to happen. Not because the afternoon had gone the way she planned, but because the people who were supposed to stop it had underestimated what it meant to the people who were supposed to protect it. She thought about her mother. She allowed herself that just for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Sloane and told her to prepare a statement for the press, and she got back to work. The press conference was at 6. Audra had done dozens of them, quarterly earnings, product launches, crisis communications, when something went wrong in a way that required a public face. She knew how to stand at a podium and deliver information and answer questions without saying anything she didn't intend to say. This one was different. She stood in front of the cameras and the microphones and the assembled journalists who had been tipped off that something significant had happened at a coastal retreat in Maryland. And she did not talk about herself. She talked about Cambridge. She talked about the communities on the deployment map, rural counties, underserved neighborhoods, the specific and irreplaceable value of a mobile clinic arriving in a town that has not had a doctor in 11 years. She talked about what it meant to build something, not because the market rewarded it quickly, but because the need for it was real, and the people it served were real, and their lives were not an abstraction. She mentioned Jonas by name. She said he had been threatened and had not broken, and that the people who had threatened him had underestimated what it means when someone believes in something enough to protect it at personal cost. She did not mention Callum by name. He had asked her not to, quietly, while they were still standing in the conference room waiting for the FBI. She had agreed without discussion because the request told her everything she needed to know about the kind of person he was. There were people who did things so they could be seen doing them, and there were people who did things because the things needed doing. And Callum Reese had never once in the entire course of that day seemed interested in being seen. When the journalist asked about Brennan Locke, she said only that the matter was in the hands of the appropriate authorities, and that Harbor Light Medical would cooperate fully with any investigation. When they asked about the future of CareBridge, she said the first mobile clinic deployment was scheduled for the following month, and that nothing about that schedule had changed. When they asked if she was all right, she said yes. She meant it. Sloan called at 8:30 that evening, while Audra was still at the office working through the restructuring documents. "The board wants a debrief on Monday," Sloan said. "The investors who stayed have already issued a joint statement of support. 3 additional foundations have reached out about partnering with CareBridge since the press conference." A pause. "Also, Jonas called to say thank you. He was fairly specific about who he was thanking, and it wasn't just you." "I know," Audra said. "Do you want me to get contact information for—" "I already have it," Audra said. "Thank you, Sloan." She hung up and sat for a moment in her quiet office, looking at the CareBridge deployment map on the wall. The dots scattered across Maryland and Virginia and West Virginia, each one representing a community that had been waiting. She thought about Callum driving home from the retreat that afternoon, probably stopping to pick up Maren from whoever had been watching her, probably making dinner, probably not saying much about what had happened. She thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who showed up when things went wrong, and then went back to ordinary life without wanting anything for it. She thought it was probably the most difficult thing in the world, and that most people never managed it. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, Audra drove herself to a public park in the Hampton neighborhood of Baltimore. She had looked up the science fair through Sloan, who had found it through the dispatch service. She had spent some time deciding whether showing up was the right call or an intrusion. She decided it was the right call. She brought a children's science kit, the kind with a small microscope and a set of safe reagents and a booklet of experiments, because it seemed useful rather than showy, and because she had learned something in the last 3 days about the difference between those two things. Callum was standing beside a folding table covered with a poster board when she found him. Maren was in front of the table, explaining something to a small group of children with the specific confidence of a 9-year-old who has practiced her presentation many times and is not remotely nervous. She was precise and patient, and slightly more thorough than the situation required, and she had her father's quality of being fully present in a space without demanding that the space accommodate her. Callum saw Audra coming. He did not look surprised. "You found us," he said. "I had help," she admitted. He looked at the science kit under her arm. "She'll like that." "I wasn't sure what was appropriate." "It's appropriate," he said. They stood for a moment, watching Maren explain the difference between a chemical and a physical reaction to an audience of 7-year-olds, who were working hard to look like they understood. One of them raised his hand and asked if an explosion was a chemical reaction, and Maren said yes, absolutely, and launched into an explanation that involved considerably more enthusiasm than the question had probably warranted. Callum almost smiled. "How is Jonas?" he asked. "Recovering. He'll be back in 2 weeks." Audra paused. "He asked about you. He wanted to know who you were." "What did you tell him?" "I said you were a driver." Callum looked at her. "For today," she added. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the thing that exists just before one, which sometimes means more than the smile itself. She made the offer directly because she had learned that indirection wasted time, and Callum did not seem like a man who appreciated the performance of casualness. "I want you to consider a role with Harbor Light," she said. "Security consulting and operations. You would work with our deployment teams as CareBridge expands site assessment, risk evaluation, staff training for the field teams going into underserved communities. The schedule is flexible. The work is on the ground, not in boardrooms." She paused. "It pays considerably more than driving." "I know what it pays," he said. "Sloan called me yesterday." Audra stopped. "Sloan called you? She said you were going to offer me a job and that I should think about it before you asked, so I didn't feel pressured into answering on the spot." Audra made a mental note to give Sloan a raise. "And did you?" she asked. "Think about it?" "Some," he said. "I need to talk to Marin first." "Of course." "She has opinions about my schedule," he said. "She's 9. Her opinions are more considered than most adults I've worked with." "That tracks," Audra said, watching Marin field a follow-up question about whether lava was a chemical or physical reaction. Marin's answer involved a volcano diagram she had drawn herself and a detailed explanation of silicate rock composition that was clearly beyond the scope of the original question. The child asking looked both overwhelmed and genuinely impressed. "The work matters," Callum said. It was not a question. "The work is the only reason the job exists," Audra said. "CareBridge goes into communities that have been waiting a long time. The people who will try to stop it won't always look like Brennan Locke. Some will be quieter. Some will be smarter." She looked at him. "I need someone who understands what it costs to protect something worth protecting." Callum was quiet for a long moment. Marin had finished her presentation and was now helping one of the younger children try a baking soda and vinegar reaction in a small plastic tray. The child's face when the fizzing started was the face of someone experiencing something they had not expected to be beautiful. Marin was explaining patiently and precisely exactly why it was happening, because understanding why something works is always more useful than just watching it work. "I'll let you know by Wednesday," Callum said. "Wednesday is fine," Audra said. He called on Tuesday. The answer was yes, with the conditions she had already agreed to, and after a conversation with Marin that he described only as thorough. He did not elaborate on what Marin had said, and Audra did not ask, because she understood that some conversations belong only to the people who have them. The first CareBridge mobile clinic rolled into the town of Garrett Falls, Maryland, on a Thursday morning in late August. Garrett Falls had not had a full-time physician within its borders for 9 years. The nearest emergency room was 41 minutes away on a good day, longer in winter when the mountain roads iced over. There were 612 registered residents, a median household income in the bottom 8% of the state, and a waiting list for the CareBridge pilot program that had been building for 4 months. The clinic arrived at 7:50 in the morning. By 8:15, there were people lined up outside, elderly residents who had come early, parents with children who needed vaccinations that had been delayed too long, a man in his 50s who had been managing a heart condition with over-the-counter medication for 3 years because the copay at the nearest cardiologist was more than his monthly food budget. Audra was there. She stood to one side of the clinic entrance and watched people come in, and did not make it about herself, because it was not about herself. Callum was there too. He was not wearing anything that identified him as part of the leadership team. He was helping people find the entrance, answering questions about wait times, guiding an elderly woman with a walker across the uneven ground between the parking area and the clinic door. The woman reached for his arm without asking. He gave it to her without hesitation. They walked to the door together, and he held it open, and she went inside. Audra watched this from across the lot, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Some things do not need commentary. Some things are simply what they are, quiet and sufficient, and more than enough. The line outside the clinic stretched to the edge of the parking area and did not shorten for the rest of the morning. Maren was there too, sitting on the tailgate of one of the supply vehicles, with a notebook recording the names of the experiments in the science kit and planning which one she wanted to try first. When the elderly woman came back out of the clinic 40 minutes later, moving more slowly than when she had gone in, but with something lighter in her face, Maren looked up from her notebook and waved. The woman waved back. Callum saw it. He didn't say anything, but Audra was standing close enough to see his expression. Not the almost smile from the park, not the careful neutrality he wore when he was watching for danger, but something quieter and more complete than either of those things. The look of a man who had found the right place to be. Audra thought about her mother. She thought about a gas station parking lot and 53 minutes and a promise made by a 22-year-old who didn't know yet what it would cost to keep it. She thought about the dots on the deployment map and the families behind each one and the years of work still ahead. She thought that this was what it looked like when something real began. Not a ceremony, not a press conference, not a signature on a contract in a room with folding chairs and borrowed coffee. Just a line of people at a door and someone holding it open, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of care arriving where it was needed. She picked up her phone and called Sloan. "Tell the team we're on schedule for the second deployment," she said. "And tell them what it looked like today. Tell them exactly what it looked like." She hung up and put her phone away and stood in the morning sun outside a mobile clinic in a town that had been waiting 9 years, and she did not feel like a CEO or a founder or a person who had survived something difficult. She felt like someone who had kept a promise. That was enough. That was everything. People like Brennan Locke exist in every industry. People who look at something built to help others and see only the profit it isn't making. And people like Callum Reese exist too. Quieter and harder to find. Carrying histories they don't talk about, and making choices that never make the news. The real lesson isn't about heroes or villains. It's simpler than that. The things worth building are always the things someone will try to take away. And the people worth trusting are almost never the loudest ones in the room. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that dignity is worth defending, and that ordinary people can carry extraordinary weight, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. We'll be telling stories like this for as long as there are stories worth telling.